Listen to that sound. Not a press, not a punch, not a machine cycling at 400 strokes a minute. Just a pair of shears held in two hands, following a line drawn in chalk on a sheet of tin. The cut is smooth, deliberate. The pressure comes not from a motor, but from the wrist, from years of understanding exactly how much force this particular gauge of metal requires. The man holding those shears has been doing this for 37 years. He learned it from a man who did it for 42. And that man learned it in a small shop in western Pennsylvania from someone who never put his knowledge into writing. Because in those days, knowledge lived somewhere else entirely. It lived in the hands. The tinsmithing is not a widely remembered trade. It doesn't carry the romance of blacksmithing or the precision mystique of watchmaking. But for most of American history, from the colonial period through the mid-20th century, the tinsmith was an essential presence in nearly every town of any size. He made the buckets your grandmother carried water in. The lanterns that lit farmyards before electricity reached the countryside. The roofing seams on buildings that still stand today. The ventilation ducts that moved air through early factories, hospitals, and schools. None of it stamped. None of it injected. Shaped by hand, piece by piece. Seam by seam. The shop itself tells you something before anyone speaks. There's a low workbench called a stake table, fitted with iron stakes of different profiles. Stakes are the tinsmiths' anvils. Not block anvils, but narrow, curved, tapered forms over which sheet metal is bent and shaped. A canister stake, a hollow mandrel, a bick iron, a creasing stake with a sharp ridge for fold work. Each one serves a specific geometry. Each one is worn in a particular place by decades of repetition. The tools hanging above them are older than the workbench. Some came with the shop when it was purchased. Some came from the master who trained the man who now works here. The shears on the far left, those came from an estate sale, from the shop of a tinsmith who retired in 1971 and had no one to pass them to. That fact is worth sitting with. If you grew up in a house where someone kept tools like this, you already know what we mean. There's a specific quality to objects that have been worked into usefulness over decades. They don't look new. They look true. The process of making even a simple tin article, say a straight-sided bucket, involves a sequence of operations that require judgment at every step. First, layout. The tinsmith begins not by cutting, but by measuring, scribing a flat pattern onto the sheet using dividers and a scratch-awl. No templates in the early trade. The pattern existed in the head, translated each time into marks on metal. An experienced tinsmith could scribe a pattern for a 2-gallon pail in under 4 minutes. In the same 4 minutes every time. Then cutting. The hand shears, sometimes called snips, come in at least 3 types. Straight shears for long cuts. Curved shears for circular patterns. Aviation shears, developed later,
Hold it steady
for
there.
compound cuts.
Got it. Keep it coming.
The correct choice
Looks like
matters.
it's seating now. Yeah,
The
one
wrong
more
shear
tap.
on a tight curve leaves a distorted
All right, check the
edge that
alignment.
won't fold cleanly. Then, forming. This is where the stake table becomes the center of the work. The cut blank is placed over the appropriate stake and
All right,
worked with a
fold this
mallet,
corner down.
wooden,
Like this?
rawhide, or bossing
Yes,
mallet,
that's it.
depending
Now
on the
crease it firmly.
operation,
Okay.
to shape the flat sheet into 3
Good.
dimensions.
Now the other side.
I did it.
No heat for this. Cold forming, done with steady, overlapping blows that move the metal progressively, rather than forcing it all at once. The hands feel resistance. They feel when the metal is working correctly and when it's beginning to stress. That knowledge is not in any manual. The seam is where the tinsmith's precision becomes visible. A hand-rolled seam, called a grooved seam or a Pittsburgh lock depending on its configuration, is formed by folding each edge of the metal in a precise sequence and then locking the 2 folds together. When properly made, A grooved seam needs no solder to be structurally sound. The mechanical interlock is enough for dry goods. For a watertight container, soldering follows. The solder used in traditional tinsmithing was a lead tin alloy, soft and low melting, applied with a copper soldering iron, heated directly in a charcoal fire, or later on a gas ring. Now, the iron was not an electric tool. It was a heavy copper bit on an iron rod, and it had to be at exactly the right temperature. Hot enough to flow the solder, cool enough not to burn through the thin tin plate or oxidize the joint before it could seal. Too cold, and the solder sat on the surface without bonding. A cold joint, structurally unreliable. One the tinsmith could feel was wrong simply by how the iron dragged. Too hot, and the flux burned away. The joint oxidized, and the work had to be cleaned and redone. The right temperature had a sound. It had a look, the way the solder moved when the iron touched it. And it had a feel in the hand, in the way the iron transferred heat through the joint and into the metal. You learned that feel. You learned it over months of bad joints and corrected ones. Eventually it became reflexive. Maybe someone in your family worked with solder and flux. Maybe you remember the smell of a workshop like this. The mineral sharpness of flux burning off. The faint sweetness of hot tin. Some of you will recognize it immediately. Ventilation work expanded the tinsmith's trade considerably in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As buildings grew larger and more complex, factories, schools, office buildings, hospitals, the demand for metal ductwork followed. Straight sections, elbows, offsets,
The measurements look right,
transitions
but I'll check
from
against the
rectangular to round.
Yes, the
Each
spacing
piece
for the fixtures
hand-cut
matches.
and hand-formed.
On to the next step.
Each joint carefully fitted and sealed. So a skilled sheet metal worker doing duct layout could look at an architectural plan and calculate the cuts in his head, accounting for the thickness of the metal, the allowances needed for seaming, the geometry of a compound angle elbow that had to fit a specific corner with specific clearances. This was geometry made physical. There was no CAD software. There was a steel rule, a combination square, a scratch-all, and 30 years of practice. The trade distinction between tinsmith and sheet metal worker became significant here. A tinsmith typically worked in lighter gauges, producing household goods and light architectural elements. A sheet metal worker handled heavier duct and roofing. But the core knowledge, layout, cutting, forming, seaming, soldering, was shared ground. Both trades were built on the same foundation. Material intuition developed through repetition, under the supervision of someone who already had it. Apprenticeship, in the traditional sense, meant something specific. You did not attend a class and then practice. You entered a shop, sometimes as young as 14, and you watched. You swept. You organized. You fetched. And while you did those things, you watched. You watched how the master held the iron. You watched the angle of his shears through a cut. You watched how he rested 2 fingers on the metal to feel the heat conducting through before he laid solder. You watched for a year before anyone put a tool in your hand. When you did begin to work, you worked on scrap. You ruined a great deal of it. You were corrected, not gently but not cruelly either, directly, with demonstration rather than explanation. The master would not say you are bending the wrong way. He would take the piece, show you the correct motion, hand it back. Understanding happened in the body before it happened in the mind. Do you think skills like this should still be taught? Not as nostalgia, but as knowledge that has its own value, separate from whether it's commercially efficient. That question doesn't have one answer. The change came gradually, not as a single moment. Mechanized stamping presses had existed since the mid-1800s, but their adoption widened steadily through the early 20th century. By the 1920s and 1930s, factory-stamped tin goods were cheaper than anything a small shop tinsmith could produce by hand. Buckets, canisters, light fixtures. The market for hand-formed goods contracted. After the Second World War, plastic and aluminum entered households at scale. Galvanized steel duct, fabricated in standard sizes and sold through supply houses, displaced a large portion of custom sheet metal work.
Keep it coming.
The tinsmith
Looks like
shop
it's
didn't
seating
close
now.
in a day.
Yeah, one more tap.
It closed over 30 years,
All right, check the
quietly,
alignment.
as work moved to factories and retirement came with no one to hand the stakes to. What remained, and remains today, is specialty work, restoration,
All right, fold
custom
this corner
architectural metal work,
Like this?
historical
Yes, that's it.
reproductions.
Now crease it firmly.
Craftsmen
Okay.
who kept the trade alive,
Good.
not because
Now
it
the
was
other side.
economically
I did it.
central, but because they understood what was being lost and chose to remain. They are not many. Have you seen a workshop like this close in your lifetime? A building that was something for decades, a shoe shop, a metalworking studio, a tailor's room that became something else? If you have, you know the particular weight of that. What the tinsmith carried in his hands was not simply technique. It was a complete relationship with a material, knowing its temper, its tendency, the way it behaved differently in cold weather, the way humidity affected the flux, the way a particular coil of solder ran differently than the last one and needed adjustment. Well, this relationship was not documented. It was transmitted person to person, in real time, over years. It cannot be reconstructed from a video. It can be approximated, partially, by someone who commits deeply and finds someone still willing to teach. There are a few. Not many, but a few. The tools are still out there, in estate sales, in the back of old hardware stores, in the workshops of craftsmen who have kept working past the age when most people stop. The knowledge is still there too, thinner than it was, but not gone. Whether it continues depends on whether anyone decides it should. Skill lives in hands, and hands do not last forever. Under this video, there's a subscribe button. It's a small action, but it helps keep stories like this alive. If craftsmanship still matters to you, if you believe skill deserves to be remembered, subscribing simply means you want these trades documented while they're still here. And before you go, tell us where you're watching from. Is there still a blacksmith in your town? A shoe repair shop? A workshop that smells like oil and wood? Have you lived this life? Or watched it fade? Share your story in the comments. That's how these trades stay visible.